In this movie, we're going to talk about snapping behavior. Revit has two basic kinds of snapping behavior. We have increment snapping behavior and we have object snapping behavior. I want to demonstrate both of those for you here in this movie. So I'm going to use the wall command to demonstrate this. The first thing I want to do is zoom out a little bit. So I'm going to use the keyboard shortcut ZO, which will zoom out 2 times. Then I'm going to run the wall command, either by clicking the tool on the architecture tab or typing WA for the keyboard shortcut. Now, it doesn't matter where you click the first point. I'm going to click anywhere. And what you'll see is a 0 coordinate will appear on screen. So the first thing you want to know about the way that Revit locates geometry in space is everything is always relative. So if you just pick a random point in space, it's always going to call that 0 because there's nothing else nearby for it to relate to. Now, what I want to do is start moving my mouse slowly. And what you're going to notice here is that it doesn't move in a smooth, fluid way. It kind of skips and jumps, as you can see. And if you look carefully, you can kind of notice that it's jumping in increments of 1,000. So that's what we mean by the increment snap behavior. When I'm zoomed out really far like this, Revit's going to use that 1,000 increment. And if I click, even though I didn't put in any number or use any dimension, I can be confident that that wall is exactly 9,000 millimeters long. If I turn the corner and go in another direction, you can see it's snapping in that direction and so on. Now I'm going to zoom in a little bit, and I'll do that with my zoom in region. And let's zoom in about like so. And now what I want you to see is that the increment has actually gotten a little bit finer. So since I've zoomed in, Revit is going to give me sort of a more precise snapping behavior. But you'll notice here that it's still snapping in a regular increment. This time it's 100 millimeters. And again, I could click and that wall is exactly 6,200 millimeters. This one is exactly 2,100 millimeters and so on. Now I'll zoom in again with the wheel this time. And at some point, you're going to see that increment change. And now it's to the nearest 10 millimeters. And then if I continued to zoom in, at some point, it might get even finer down to the actual millimeter. So let me escape out of there. I'm going to do ZF to zoom to fit. And let's see where that setting is controlled. Now I'm going to go to the Manage tab, and I'm going to click here on the Snaps button. Right here at the top is where that increment is actually controlled. So you can see that it started at 1,000, then it went to 100, then to 20, and then finally to 5. Okay. Now you could actually add your own increments in here if you wanted. If you didn't want to go from 20 to 5, if you wanted to go from 20 to 10, then to 5, you could just type in 10. Now you don't even have to put them in order, because if you OK, and then you go back in there, Revit will resort them for you. So now what would happen is I'd have to be zoomed in pretty close to see that new increment, but now it would start to use that new increment when I zoomed in to an appropriate level. And at some point, I'll start to see it. So feel free to add other increments if you wish. I'm going to zoom back out a little bit here. I'll just roll my wheel. And I do want to point out one other thing about the snaps. Regardless of what the increments are set to, if your cursor gets nearby some existing geometry, Revit will always favor the existing geometry over the increment snap. So if I start out here, I'm getting the 0, I'm getting the snapping behavior, but as soon as I get nearby some other wall, you notice how it latches onto that wall with a small dashed line. So it will always favor existing geometry over whatever your snap increment is set to, because it's going to assume that that's a more important relationship. And you can see here that it's actually down to 0.3 millimeters in this case. So it's a much more precise value. Okay, let's go back to Manage. Let's click on Snaps again, and let's look at the next part of the dialog. If you look at the middle section where it says Object Snaps, you can see that all of the standard object snaps that you would expect in any CAD program are here in Revit as well. So we can snap to endpoints, midpoints, intersections, perpendicular, tangent. Now we saw some examples of this already, but notice that they're all turned on. It is possible to turn on and off different ones. So if there's certain snaps that you don't want, you can do that. And then I really want you to look at the letters in parentheses, because just like our commands, our object snaps also have keyboard shortcuts. So they're pretty easy to remember because every one of them starts with the letter S, and then it's just the first letter of the snap. So SE for endpoint and SM for midpoint and so on. So let's go ahead and click OK here and try those out. So I'm going to go back to architecture and click the wall tool and start moving my mouse around near existing geometry. I'll get a little square for endpoint. I'll get a small triangle for midpoint. Let's see, let's do this. And then we'll get a little X there for an intersection. So you can start to see when it's going to find those different snap points and then click. Now, if for some reason it's trying to give you a snap that you don't want, like here it's giving me endpoint, and I really wanted the midpoint, let's say, that's where those keyboard shortcuts come in. So I could type SM, and now if I highlight this wall, anywhere on this wall, it'll snap to the midpoint. Anywhere on this wall, it'll snap to the midpoint. And then after I click that, it'll go back to looking for everything. Okay, so think of that as a one-time override. So the snapping behavior is both the increment snaps and the object snaps, and they're both designed to help you get a great deal of precision and accuracy without your having to work really hard to do it. So they're really handy features and something that's basically there all the time working in the background as you work within your Revit projects.